Hello and welcome to this episode of ESG Talk, your go-to source for insights and advice from leaders in environmental, social, and governance. I'm your host, Ernest and Anunciacion, filling in for Mandy McReynolds. Today we have the pleasure of speaking with Nancy Jordan, Vice President of Internal Audit at Cornerstone Building Brands, and Tom Rams, Senior Director of SOX and Internal Audit at 8x8. So in today's episode, we're going to be discussing how Tom and Nancy's internal audit teams are embracing ESG and the lessons that they've learned on the path to ESG assurance. Before we dive in, I'd love to start with where each of your organizations is at on your own ESG journeys. So Nancy, Cornerstone Building Brands recently completed its second ESG report. How involved was your team in that reporting process?
We were extremely involved. We were asked by the audit committee as a second year to continue the data validation. So we did 100% data validation in addition to a third party that came in and leveraged our work as well as did some data validation on their own. And not only as part of the data validation, but we've been involved in the steerco committees. We've been involved in discussions on how data is going to be pulled, what kind of data we can report. And even this year, for the second year in a row, we were very involved in discussions. Do we have the right level of support that we can actually disclose this data versus choosing to not disclose the data? So there's been a lot of ongoing conversations throughout this second reporting year and some additional lessons learned in other areas. But I would say, we're very, very involved in everything from the developing the procedures for how we're gathering the data to how we're actually reporting the data, as well as even reviewing the draft reports and providing feedback on the draft reports themselves.
Awesome. Yeah, we're definitely going to be digging into your process a little bit more. Tom, in contrast, 8x8 is relatively new to the world of ESG reporting. And so I think we're interested to know, what is it that your team is focusing on as 8x8 builds out their ESG program?
That's a fair question. So at 8x8, our investor relations team owns ESG reporting, and my internal audit team has been partnering with them to understand their progression as they're maturing the program. So as of today, they've spent some time building out the Workiva ESG solution, and they've hired a third party to perform a gap analysis, which has allowed them and my team to understand, which frameworks, which regulatory bodies, what reporting requirements are going to be needed, whether that's, quarter over quarter, month over month, year over year. And it's really helped us set the prioritization for the program. If I think more targetedly into my internal audit team, we've got 2 audits on the plan for this coming year. One is a deep dive into the UK carbon reduction plan that we release on an annual basis. And that's really to allow the ESG team to see what a deep dive audit could look like, from completeness and accuracy of data to the underlying IT general controls for the systems that support it. And it's really that first attempt for us to show what an audit would look like. We also have our ongoing maturity internal audit, where we just try and make sure we're staying up to date on the program since there's so many facets to it. But we'll leverage that gap analysis to make sure that we're staying on top of the program as we go.
That's great. And we're kind of seeing ESG reporting mature. And as that's happening, there's this convergence that's happening between ESG financial reporting with that governance, risk, and compliance oversight, or GRC. But we're finding that in a lot of organizations, these teams are still operating in silos. And that compounds the complexity of what each team is working on, since ultimately they need to work together. And so, Tom, I'm really interested, how do you see, or should these organizations integrate those teams that are responsible for those 3 areas of financial reporting, ESG, and GRC? How did you get the seat at the table?
Yeah, I think the easy answer is yes, they should all be integrated: financial reporting, GRC, ESG. But even in addition to those teams, we really need to think about it as a cross-functional exercise, because the S of ESG is still social. And so we're making sure our HR, our talent teams have a seat at the table. When we think about data that needs to be collected from an environmental standpoint, we still need to be making sure our product teams, our engineering teams have a seat at the table, because we may need to build in capabilities into our products to make sure we can collect and report on certain elements. And then you're still going to have traditional teams like back office IT, legal, information security that also need to be involved from a reporting standpoint, where are your risk factors in the 10K consistent with your sustainability reporting risks that you're highlighting? Are these the statements that the legal team wants to make? Are you disclosing items that the information security team doesn't want shared? So it's really a cross-functional effort to where I'm hoping organizations are thinking of it from an organizational change management standpoint, because all parties really need to be involved.
And Nancy, you mentioned that the audit committee is kind of mandating your involvement with it. How are you connecting with these teams at Cornerstone? And what do you see are some of the risks related to keeping them siloed?
The nice thing that we did last year as part of the year one is we created a template that said for every data source, here's the report that was provided, and here's the person/role that provided it. So to me, that's one area that's really helped connect it, because it gives you that sustainability year over year. That, for example, you have a new person in ESG reporting, they can go to this template and say, okay, here's the role or the department and the exact report they provided last year. Because one of the risks, if you don't do that, is that you're going to keep getting different reports. And I know there's been a lot of discussion about data accuracy. Well, if you're starting to compare different reports from year to year, that's going to make it very hard. The other area that we've really connected this year is even our financial reporting team. Because we have, risk management, we have facilities, and it's interesting. You think, oh, all the data should be the same, but it's not always the same. For the second year in a row, we found out, depending on how you define a location, which goes back to your kind of operating procedures on how you want to report ESG data, a location can be different. And so we wanted to make sure that we connected the ESG reporting team to the financial reporting team, so that even our number of locations and our manufacturing locations is the same between what we report in our K and what we report in our ESG report. The other thing, that I think about in connecting teams is, ESG is still so new, and it doesn't matter where you started, but everyone now has this sort of a framework, and it's evolving. And what we have found from year to year is the metrics that we're trying to focus on has shifted a little bit.
Yeah, and I think that lends nicely to what Tom was talking about in terms of that change management, because most likely a lot of those folks don't think about it from a risk and control or governance perspective, right? They're just doing their jobs. And then also, Nancy, to your point of ESG being so new, we've seen recently various proposals and adoption of significant new ESG regulations in various parts of the world. For example, the EU Parliament recently passed the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, or CSRD, and that's going to kind of phase in starting next year in 2024. Likewise, we have the SEC's climate disclosure proposal here in the US, and we're kind of waiting, for that final ruling to come any day now. So, Tom, let's turn it back to you. How have these regulations impacted 8x8's approach to ESG reporting, and what are you doing to prepare for that compliance?
Yeah, so as I mentioned earlier, we've done a gap analysis by framework, regulatory body, prioritization. And so for us, with the CSRD coming into law within the European Union, we're now waiting to see for countries that we operate in, what are the country-specific laws that come about to see if we need to comply or not. From a more broad standpoint, we've really started to go through the analysis of, here are the criteria for the regulation. Do we comply? Do we need to report? And so we have a baseline of where we expect to be as of today, but we are still trying to make sure that we're aggregating ESG related data on the go forward. So as new things come about, we're ready to go when reporting is required. And that really is the case for us with the US SEC climate disclosure proposal, where we need to make sure that we at least have scope 1 and scope 2 ready to go. And so we're building that out within our solutions so that we have data cards and information ready to go. When that'll happen, we're still kind of TBD like the rest of the market, but we want to be as ready as we can be because there is a lot of data, a lot of organization across the company that needs to occur.
Let's dive in a little bit deeper in terms of ESG and the reporting process. It's going to entail, collecting, managing, analyzing both financial data and non-financial data that's coming from various disparate systems. And unlike a lot of the data that's required by existing regulations, ESG data is often unstructured and it's scattered throughout the organization, which presents these challenges of data management. So Tom, what do you see are some of the biggest obstacles when it comes to ESG data and controls?
So, one that we've spoken to is going to be stakeholder involvement. There's going to be a disparate set of data, as you mentioned. So, having the right stakeholders involved is a significant obstacle. One that's more near and dear to my heart is when I think about SOX from 20 years ago being implemented to where we are today, the technology landscape has changed, and the auditor requirements and standards are much more mature. So I view it as there's a large chasm right now between ESG frameworks, what organizations are doing, and what auditors or regulators are going to expect that they're doing. And so an auditor today is probably asking themselves where the ESG data is, how did it get into that system? Was it an integration? Was it manually uploaded? Did someone do any type of transformation to the data? To where do you have ITGCs over the system? How's that data coming out completely and accurately? Is the data consistent with where else you're reporting on it? All the way up to, the final submissions as part of maybe a disclosure. So there's so much involved with the data and what the auditors are going to expect from the start that I think there's going to be a large requirement of maturation from the ESG side to where we as auditors or organizations in general are going to have to do a lot of education, training, functional requirements gathering, and back to that organizational change management as well. So that to me is probably the most significant obstacle of how do we get the auditors and regulators back aligned with where ESG functions are currently at. And then at the end as well, it's going to come down to do we even have the data, right? I think everyone's thinking about how to make sure it's complete and accurate, but no one's thinking about do I even have it? Do I need to go back to my engineering team and have them implement a solution to our code in order to start collecting the data that's required? That in and of itself may take time, right? It's got to go through an IT change management process. And then once it's in, there still needs to be a period of time that occurs to allow for data collection. And so I think organizations just need to be careful with the amount of time it's going to take to fully ramp up and implement data collection. So that's a couple that I'm seeing. I do see some silver lining though, because when I think of where we're at with ESG and all the different frameworks, GRC and technology frameworks are in a similar boat. You've got NIST, ISO, trust services with respect to the SOC 2s or SOC 1s. And so, companies that are able to implement controls that meet the most restrictive requirements in order to be most efficient with their controls are probably going to be the ones that see the most success in this space.
Tom, that's a fantastic point. I think the biggest unknown is do we have the right data? And so not knowing what you don't know, that's probably the biggest risk there. Nancy, as you've gone and audited your ESG reports and you've helped the organization kind of tighten up the control environment over the ESG data, have you seen any shifts in terms of how decisions are being made now that data is a little bit more reliable and available?
Definitely, kind of touching on some of Tom's points. What we learned last year is some of the data, when we asked for data, it was like, oh, here it is. It's on a napkin. Oh, here, I have this little Excel file that I've just added some numbers together. And we're like, okay, I'm not sure that we can really report out, data coming from a napkin or something, a little Excel file that you just added some numbers together. Where did you get the numbers? Where did you get the support? So I think decisions are now shifting. People are understanding the data. And for us, we've actually employed, some third-party service providers to help us collect the data so that we actually can make better decisions. An example I can think of is like water usage, and same thing with electricity. So we have third parties that actually take those invoices, they collect those invoices, they can now present them to us by plant, by quarter, so we can actually decide what we want to report on, and do we have the right level of data, and do we even have enough data? Because I know that we ran into a whole talking point about we are missing some data, but how many plants does it impact, and do we still have a high enough percentage that we feel comfortable presenting the data? And then that actually comes to okay, if you present the data, what decision do you make on what you exclude, and how you actually footnote what you exclude. And so we are having a lot of discussions and decisions being made on that we didn't have before, because we didn't have, quite honestly, some of the data. And it's interesting, even decisions on how do you handle when people have chosen like not to disclose, are they male or female? It's something you don't think about, but your HR systems don't require you to disclose that. So all of a sudden you start getting percentages and you're like, these don't add up to the number of employees that we say. And so now we have to make a decision on, if they don't add up, what do we do with that data? Because it is valid data. So we've actually talked and made decisions on, we're going to include this with a footnote to say X number of people chose not to disclose. And, we even had decision points on ethics and compliance, what actually constitutes a fraud. And we found out that different people had different views on what constituted a fraud. And I know, Tom, you and I have kind of talked about that you have to have that alignment and between stakeholders. And so these decisions are ones that you have to start making and having these conversations as you start pulling the ESG reports together. And from what I see, they evolve year to year to year.
Absolutely. And, as we've mentioned before, ESG reporting is such a new frontier for internal auditing teams. Nancy, Tom, thank you so much for joining us for this episode of ESG Talk. It's always a pleasure and always enjoy our conversations. And thank you to our listeners and viewers. ESG Talk is brought to you by Workiva, the world's only unified platform for financial reporting, ESG, audit, and risk. It's been a pleasure being a guest host once again. Hopefully they'll invite me back. I look forward to returning with more guests and more episodes exploring ESG and GRC. And if you enjoyed this one, please rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts and subscribe to see future episodes on Apple, Spotify, or YouTube.